have a little truth.
Welcome to the Michael Opitz Show. Today we have with us candidate for the U.S. Senate, Derrick Grayson. And Derrick is running for Saxby Chambliss vacating Senate seat. Derrick, how's the campaign going?
From my perspective, it's going quite well.
Wonderful. Derrick, I've got some questions to ask, and I know you're anxious to share your point of view with not only this audience, but the people throughout Georgia. Jobs is so very important to all of us, and manufacturing is the foundation for the middle class, which is essential to social and political stability, and most importantly, to the wealth of our country. Without manufacturing, we have a shrinking tax base and a greater gap between the upper and lower economic classes. And we've seen a mass exodus of manufacturing jobs from the United States to China and third world countries. Why has this happened?
Government, and I know that's a very simplistic answer. Our government engages in policies that have allowed businesses, particularly large corporations, to still make a profit and bypass excessive regulations in this country by exporting jobs overseas. If we want that to change, government is going to have to change their policies. Now, where I would start, first thing I would do is propose legislation to get rid of all tax breaks for corporations, all businesses. Kaput, gone. Government does not create jobs. The American people, they are the ones who create jobs for America. When we wipe out those tax breaks and then approach businesses from this perspective, we say, if you want a tax break, hire Americans first. You will see those jobs start to come back. Government simply needs to get out of the way, and nobody has been willing on either side of the aisle to take a stance. We have corporations like Apple that can avoid taxes by offshoring their revenues. We have companies like General Motors that the American taxpayer bailed out under the guise of saving American jobs. And as soon as they were bailed out, what was a couple of the first things that they did? Shut down manufacturing plants, source those jobs overseas, and close hundreds of dealerships here in America. Those were American jobs. If you call Cisco's technical support, you get somebody over in India. Those used to be American jobs. I have a problem with that. We ought to be rewarding companies that put Americans to work.
And what do you think about America's corporate taxes being the highest in the world at 37%? Because then what happens is those taxes are included in the price of the product, which is passed on to the consumers. And that contributes to our being higher than other companies in other countries in the world with similar and competing products.
One thing that the American people don't understand, and for whatever reason have been unwilling to see, is our government has the ability to turn the tide and level the field. If they wanted to stop that, they would get out of the way of the business, lower those taxes, because all the corporations are doing is just what you said, passing it on to the American people. One of the things that our government has started to doing, because they learned a very valuable lesson from George Bush Sr. when he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." He was summarily fired and Bill Clinton elected. So our government learned a valuable lesson. We cannot rob the American people by creating new taxes. We have to find more creative ways of taxing them. So we'll do it through corporations who will pass it on to the taxpayers. We'll do it through things like the new ad valorem tax that Georgia implemented here. We'll do it through things like the internet sales tax that they want to put down us. These are the things that they engage in because they know not to say new taxes, They just find creative ways to tax us more and more.
And that they do.
Yes.
Free trade was a big issue 10, 15 years ago, and free trade has been implemented to a very, very high degree. Has free trade contributed to the flight of manufacturing jobs to other countries where now companies can send their manufacturing overseas and return the products to the United States without incurring any tariffs, which have long been the foundation as a funding for government?
It is sickening to me and unconscionable that people in Washington can allow for us to import more goods than we export, and especially at lower costs. That's government policy again. I can't re-emphasize enough. It's simply government being in the way. And the last time I checked the numbers, we import more than we export, and it costs us more to simply export. We're not doing American business any favors from a government's perspective when it comes to helping this economy. Michael, I'll say it again. Government has to get out of the way, but the only way we will get government out of the way is we start firing some of the people that are up there in government. Government is a reflection of our choices.
You're absolutely right. Michelle Bachmann has long stated that our policies, our trade policies that lead to the $17 trillion trade deficit, and we know that's going to bankrupt our country, as it did the Soviet Union. And when it happened in the Soviet Union, we saw everyday citizens living in cardboard boxes for a time. And people think that it can't happen here. But unless we get our trade balance under control, and you think these are normal government operations. Typically, you go to the international markets to borrow money for funding those exceptional things such as war. Of course, we've been at war for years and years. And other events where you need to step outside and increase your borrowing, just like you do in your normal household. But we borrow just to finance our everyday functions in the federal government. What is your reflection on that?
And let me use a more recent example to kind of outline what's going on with our monetary policies. And what I'm highlighting is the mentality. The debt ceiling. We've been operating on continuing resolutions for a number of years. That is not what the Constitution intended. It intended for us to have a balanced budget. So we say, okay, our debt ceiling is $1,000, but next year we're going to spend $2,000. So we're going to need to raise the credit limit to $2,000. Why are we spending more than what we earn? Every time we raise the debt ceiling, it gives the Federal Reserve the ability to print more fiat money. Our money is tied merely to oil, which is tied to the market trends of oil prices. And I know I'm getting into the weeds and most Americans don't understand that, but what Americans can understand is if we continue on the path that we are, we will end up like they were over in Germany, where they were pushing around wheelbarrows full of money just to go and buy a loaf of bread. And that is where we are heading.
Derrick, you mentioned the Federal Reserve, so I have to come in with a question. A lot of folks think that the Federal Reserve is a branch of the federal government when it is not. It was created, as you know, in 1913 and was promoted by the progressive president Woodrow Wilson, who later recanted his support for doing so. He said, I fear, in his personal diary, he said, I fear that I have now destroyed our nation. The Federal Reserve Bank is a bank owned by private individuals. It's privately held stock and not publicly traded. And the central banks around the world all communicate together, and their goal is to make money. Andrew Jackson got rid of the central bank of his time, tore it out by the roots, and he told the American people at that time, he said, do not ever let it come back, or it will destroy the nation and bankrupt the nation and destroy your children's future. I'm certain you have a comment on that. What would you do with the Federal Reserve Bank?
The first thing that I would do is audit the Federal Reserve. People need something tangible to show them what the Federal Reserve has been up to. But here's a problem. It is the people in Washington that block and stand in the way of the audit. And they are able to do that because the American people won't hold them accountable for the positions that they hold. I will always come back to this. Our government is a reflection of the people. Now, while the hearts and minds of the people might be that we want the best for this country, when we trust folk that have time and time again shown us that they are not going to do what they should be doing, and we allow people to posture and say what they are fighting for, but no substantive change is taking place, we will continue to get the same things that we are getting. The IRS needs to go. The Federal Reserve, it needs to go. Career politicians, they need to go. But none of this, Michael, will come to play until we start to elect people that are willing to die for the very Constitution that they are supposed to be honoring. And that's what this is coming down to.
Derrick, you mentioned the Constitution. The Constitution is what allows us to say, as we've said since its inception, that in America there is rule of law and not rule of men. And the Constitution ensures that we have the rule of law, but of course the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the President all have to enforce that Constitution as they are sworn to enforce. But we've seen that that's not happened recently and has not happened in the last several years. What are your comments about that?
The dumbing down of America. Now, I'm a black man, that should be obvious to everyone. I know up close, and I've seen personally, the destruction of the educational system within the black community. When you don't teach people the things that they need to know, like constitutional history, people will then go out into the world not understanding how people are supposed to be operating that represent them. One of the key and fundamental aspects of the Constitution is in the preamble, we the people. That has been somehow or another morphed into we the leaders of the people, because that is the way that they operate. Our Constitution is our guide. Our Constitution lays out the framework for which they should operate, but when the people aren't aware of what the Constitution is even about, they aren't even in a position to fight. That's why, Michael, people like you and I, we have to educate, re-educate, we have to, if necessary, even be willing to die to set the captives free. And that is where we are here in America. We have a bunch of captive people that have been placed in a situation where they only see the R and the D. They no longer see the Constitution. They no longer understand the Constitution. When a politician stands up and says, I have 4 tests for my job, is it based on Judeo-Christian values? Can we afford it? Do we need it? Is it constitutional? We've already lost the battle. There's only one document that our representatives need to do their job, and that's the Constitution. My personal faith, that's a personal thing. Can we afford it? Is irrelevant if it's unconstitutional. Do we need it? Again, is irrelevant if it's unconstitutional. The only question is if it is constitutional. But when the people aren't aware of the nature and aspects of what the Constitution is all about, it is easy to befuddle them and turn them into sheeple. I know people hate that word, but it is what it is.
Oh, there's a lot of truth in that. And we see from the propaganda minister in Nazi German on Goebbels, if you tell the big lie long enough and loud enough, people will come to believe it. You mentioned the Constitution. We just talked about the Constitution. Let's take a look at the Second Amendment, and please allow me to read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, there are a lot of folks who say, well, that really applies to keeping guns for a hunting. The regulated, in the meaning of the word back then, meant well-trained. And the militia, if we think back to Concord and Paul Revere's Ride, the British Are Coming, the people took the guns from their home and they all gathered together, individual citizens, and formed a militia. So we see that the government now, and has been for a number of years, trying to take guns away from American citizens. Where do you stand on that?
Let me say something that is unpopular, and some people will say, Michael, well, there you go again, using race. From my perspective, race is irrelevant. But my head is not in the sand. I understand that race has been used as a tool for hundreds of years by various nations. The United States is no different. These attacks on gun control is not to eliminate crime. Who owns most of the guns legally in this country? Middle-class white Americans. So when we implement gun control against law-abiding citizens, whose rights are we infringing upon? The majority, middle-class white Americans. Crooks don't care about gun control. Blacks have been engaged in gun violence, black-on-black crime for the last 20 years with high-capacity magazines, automatic weapons, the list goes on. But nobody talked about that. But let no crisis be wasted from government perspective. Government wants to identify who owns the guns. They then want to restrict what weapons you can own. They would rather you only have a shotgun or a 6-shot revolver when they come to kick your door down, because they don't want you to be able to meet force with force. The gun control or the Second Amendment was not about hunting. It was about our ability to protect ourselves from a government engaged in tyrannical activities. And if people think that our government is not capable of tyrannical activities, Waco, Kent State, slavery, the Salem witch trials. I can go on and on and on with events where the government was at the head. They were leading the charge in tyrannical activities. This is the only reason they don't want us to own guns. And with Obama's little list that he came out with on gun control, where he basically said to doctors, don't be afraid to let us know who's got a mental issue so that we can identify him. All of the kids in school that are now going on government programs where they're receiving Ritalin, mental disabilities, all in an effort to identify and restrict gun ownership. And that's what it's about. So some people will say I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I've got history on my side.
And indeed, you do have history on your side, because if we look at the issue of hunting versus defending ourselves from government tyranny, the founders of our country were under British control and British rule. And Patrick Henry, when he made his, Paul Revere, when he made his midnight ride, what was happening is the British were coming to take their guns and their gunpowder. So that's where the Second Amendment came from, because they saw it happening. And they wanted to make sure that there was an amendment in the Constitution to ensure that the government, in the form of King George or any other succeeding government, could not take people's guns to defend their rights and defend their property.
And another note on that, American history, the first use of the gun control measures in the Carolinas, KKK wanted laws that would restrict gun ownership from blacks. Why? So that they could do their night rides unfettered. This is nothing different than that with our government. They want to be able to kick your door down, and they want to have the advantage when they kick in your door. Americans need to buy guns. They need to be well armed. And if they're talking about a well-regulated militia, go and take a class at a gun shooting range. That will qualify you to own that gun. So that'll take care of that. And you'll be well within your rights in the Second Amendment.
And that leads us into state sovereignty issues. If we, I was in Arizona last year, And it was interesting when I went to one of the towns in Arizona, I saw people walking down the street in cowboy garb with a 6-gun on their hip. It was loaded, and the cowboys were drinking beer and hard liquor at the bar while wearing their 6 guns. As a matter of fact, the owner of the bar encouraged them to come in and drink because they presented a nice decor to the patrons. But in Arizona, there is no concealed weapons license. There is open carry, and everybody is guaranteed open carry. So what do you think about open carry or within the state of Georgia when the Second Amendment gives you the right to carry and own a firearm?
I would feel safer in this room, in a church, in a bar, at a football game, if people were allowed to open carry. Crooks think twice about misbehaving when people are able to defend themselves. I met a gentleman last night who talked about one of the House bills that we have here in Georgia, where they are trying to get it approved for carry permits for people on college campuses and churches, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, we have a couple of senators that are fighting against that. I said, well, expose them. This is how you change the room. Only you know about that. See, I didn't know about that. Who are they? Give me their names. I say, if you tell the American people, because apparently the House approved it, so it must be something the people want. But if you've got a few senators that are holding out, tell us who they are so that the American people can deal with them. I said, who are they beholden to? He said, the Board of Regents. And that's where we're upside down here in this country. Not just statewide or local, but even at a national level. We're beholden, our representatives that is, are beholden to special interests and corporate interests in the group dynamic. If you want that to turn around, Michael, we need to expose those that are representing those other than we the people. So I don't have a problem. Are you packing right now? I'll feel much safer.
Well, I'm sorry, you have to feel more insecure about not packing right now.
Okay.
But I do have a right to carry. Is that the appropriate term, the right to carry permit? The Second Amendment gives us that, but
Yes.
I also have the license from Cobb County.
Well, that's great. I applaud you.
If we look at the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution provides us, and I'll read that if I may. It's the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be searched. Wouldn't you think that includes people's computers
Absolutely.
and data on the computers?
Absolutely.
Well, if we look at what's been happening with NSA, where they are, and it's been in the news just this week, and today it was discussed on national news, that NSA is wiretapping Angela Merkel's phone, her personal cell phone. And one of the defenders of this practice said, oh, but they're not listening to her actually talking, they're just merely collecting the metadata. So how do we know that they're not listening to Angela Merkel's personal cell phone and to the French and the Brazilians president as well?
First off, we don't know. And so that people understand the term metadata, they threw that term out because they knew the average American citizen wouldn't know what it meant. But metadata is data about data. And in order to have data about data, you have to have the data in order to have the data about that data. So they've got it in their possession. We don't know that they're not listening to it. But here's the problem. I didn't know they were getting it in the first place. Why should I believe that they're not listening to it? So my point is, they lied to us in the first place. There's a representative, I don't recall his name, he said, we were briefed about these things, but there are rules in place that keep us from talking about it. And I said to myself, well, you've already violated your oath of office because you vowed to uphold the Constitution. That included the Fourth Amendment, and you know that this is a violation. Thank God for Eric Snowden, because we wouldn't know. But see, here is something else that I've said to folk that I've talked to, Michael. I said, now ask your representatives the next time you see them. Eric Snowden came out and told us about this metadata in the phones. But last week, a story was released that they were also getting copies of our internet address books. They knew that back then too. Ask your representative, well, if you already knew they was getting our phone data, why didn't you just say, okay, gigs up, we getting your phone data, I may as well tell you, since the horse has been let out of the barn, the cat's out the bag, the pig's out of the poke, or whatever the case may be, we're also getting your internet address books too. So anything you've got in your Google, your YouTube, or Outlook address books, we've got that information too. We know who you talk to, we know their addresses, their phone number. Why didn't they tell us that? They wait until we find out and then they react to it. That is the fundamental problem for me with our representation in DC. They know things that they don't tell us about, and when we find out, then they decide to react and give us some story.
Let me underscore your comment on that. We're about to wrap up, but this is important. Back during the 1990s, and I was with Lucent Technologies at that time, but back during the 1990s, there was there was legislation passed called Kaleo. And what Kaleo does is we had new digital switches. Before that, we had the mechanical switches, and if you wanted to do a wiretap on someone's phone, you had to present a court order to the local telephone company, and they would complete the wiretap. So that was the protection that we all had. But with all the digital switches, Kaleo, the law that Congress passed and the president during the 90s signed into place, allowed the federal government to go inside the big telecommunication switches, put in your phone number, and listen live to calls without any security and any prevention from a judge to issue the order. Now, they're still supposed to have the judges, but now they could do it without getting a judge's approval. Two guys in a back room could make that happen. So they could, using the same technology, they could listen in on Andrea Merkel's phone as well. Now, we were told that they were not doing that wittingly by Eric Clapper. And as soon as he said that, I knew that he was not telling the truth, because I knew what the truth was. And that just underscored your point, that they knew, but they're not telling us what they're doing.
Just like the government shutdown, bulk of the government still functioning. They knew that it was a ruse. They knew that even if Obamacare was defunded, it would only be the pieces under discretionary spending, not under mandatory spending. They knew that it was a waste of time, but they didn't tell us. And when they passed the continuing resolution, what did they do? They had a bunch of pork in it that they didn't tell us about. I have a problem with that.
And I have a problem with that as well. There are so many questions in this conversation that we're having, and so many subjects that we're not going to be able to cover. But we'd like to take an opportunity to have questions from our audience.
Absolutely.
So that folks can ask you their questions, not just my questions. So we'd like to have someone come up and ask a question, if you have a question. And the first person up is Jack Staver. Jack, what question do you have?
Well, my question was kind of a two parts, kind of a comment and a question. Recently, we've had our existing senators, Isaacson and Chambliss, specifically Isaacson, had said how stupid it was for us to even try to stop Obamacare, everything we're doing, that, to listen to the people, what they're doing is wrong, whether it's decorum or whatever they want to call it. But my question to you is, where do you stand on like what Ted Cruz and these guys did, where they actually stood up because, what was it? I believe it was 54 or 60% of the American people said, we want this thing shut down, and they stood up for us. Where Isaacson and Chambliss both stand for the establishment, and like I say, telling us we're stupid. So I just want to know where your stance is.
Can you handle the truth?
Absolutely.
That standing up was posturing. It was a waste of time. We elect our representatives to go and do a job. not to go and use federal employees, because the only people who suffered were those federal employees who didn't get paid for the 2 or 3 weeks that they were out of work. They're the only ones who suffered. It didn't impact me not one way or another. When I flew to DC, I still got patted down by the government. Military still dropped bombs, they still spied, but Congress, they kept getting their paychecks. But the people who suffered were federal employees. Ted Cruz and all the others, they already knew it wasn't going to do a bit of good, but we elect them to do their job. If anybody was going to give up their paychecks, they should have said, we won't get paid, and we'll let all the federal employees continue to get paid until we can work this out. Nobody else will suffer because of our inability to do our job. The American people count on and depend on their representatives to do what we elected them to do. So to go and shut down the government was not the right answer. Do I hate Obamacare? Of course I do. But they know that the only way to get rid of Obamacare is with a repeal. They know that, and that's where they should have started. Thank you.
And to follow up on Jack's question, when we look at who was responsible for shutting down the federal government, there are folks who can say the Democrats were responsible and others say the Republicans, because the Republicans put forward many bills offering to fund different areas of the federal government, with the one exception, and that was the funding of Obamacare. So if that had been accepted, those bills had been accepted in the Senate, at least those federal employees could have gone back to work while still dealing with the issue as a separate issue of the funding of Obamacare.
Problem is, the only portions of Obamacare that would have been defunded are those that were under discretionary spending. Obamacare is law, so whatever was under mandatory spending would have still been spent. They would have not gotten rid of Obamacare. That is the ugly truth that is being denied by our representatives. All you have to do is ask them. I promise you, they will either tell the truth or they will lie, because it is easily looked up. And that's why I have a problem with it.
America has had for years the best medical system and the best technologies in the world, but many think that we are in danger of losing it. Our government is a government of, for, and by the people. And that famous quote by Nancy Pelosi, we have to pass the bill to find out what is in it. Americans did not have a say, and now Americans are finding out that they are forced to do what they have not approved. By many view this as tyranny, and tyranny becomes dictatorship when people do not give their consent to be governed. And never before has America been taxed for inaction, but now we have a law that is highly unpopular with American citizens, with penalties that will limit our freedom to choose what is best for us. How is Obamacare fully implemented going to affect the American healthcare system?
It is going to screw the country. Simple answer, but that is it. Employers, Trader Joe's has already said we're going to cut our employees back to 29 hours to avoid the fine. That's going to force them out into the market. Those employees are going to lose in two ways. They're going to, one, lose 11 hours of work a week, and they're going to be paying more for medical care than if they had opted to get it under Trader Joe's if it was offered. That's a downside to me. UPS told their white-collar workers, we will now only cover you, not your spouses or your families. That's a downside. People that didn't want health care, those young folk that feel, hey, I'm healthy, I don't need health insurance, I don't want to pay the expense, they're now going to have to get health care insurance to help pay for the folk who don't work. That's a downside to me. There are no upsides to Obamacare. But again, Michael, I always say, Obama didn't do this by himself. When Hillary Care failed, the Republicans had an opportunity to fix the pieces of our current healthcare system that was broken. They didn't. Now we have Obamacare. Now it has to be dealt with. But causing federal employees to suffer because they didn't do what they should have done before is inexcusable. I will not excuse it.
We're in the final stages of our discussion, but if you could leave us with your top three, important priorities if you are elected to the U.S. Senate, what would those top three priorities be?
Education. Urban schools have already been destroyed by government policies. Common Core now seeks to do it to the whole of America. If that happens to the whole of America, there will be no hope for this country in the next generation, because those kids will be ill-equipped to even recognize the invisible bars of slavery that our government is bringing down on us right now. Our military, and not because I'm like some of my opponents, I want a strong military, equipped, well-armed, so they can go and win. How dare you send men and women off to fight, and when they come home, they have to go through an adversarial process to get the care that they need. When our troops have a higher suicide rate than those of the American citizens, something is wrong. It is not with the military. It's with the people who are in charge of the military and employment. I want government, excuse me for saying it this way, I want them to get the hell out of the way and let Americans get back to creating jobs for Americans. Those are my top three.
And I see we have another question from the audience.
Yes, my name is Barbie Dunn from Fayette County. One of the things we've been fighting very aggressively in Fayette County, again, is Common Core. Could you elaborate a little bit more your stance on Common Core?
Sure. I could give you just one sentence. I'm against it. But to be simplistic, Common Core is a one shoe size fits all. That is to provide training as if everybody coming through our school system is going to be prepared to go to college. When I was in college, when I was in grade school and high school, they taught us different things. There were alternative paths. If you knew you didn't want to be a doctor, you could be an auto mechanic. They had auto shop. If you knew you wanted to work with your hands in other ways, we had wood shop, metal shop. They even had home economics. I took a course, learned how to balance a checkbook and bake a cake. So there were other things, other paths. People that didn't want to go through high school, they could go to Job Corps and still get a high school equivalency education. Common Core is now going to force everybody into one box. And face it, everybody is not a rocket scientist. Everybody is not going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a career politician. Everybody is not going to follow the same course in their lives. We need more alternatives for our students. Not one shoebox, and certainly not one size. And that is why I am against Common Core. Government has no business determining what is best for our children. That's the job of the parents and their local governments, period.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. Jim Soretti.
We would like to know what your position is in general on immigration and in particular illegal immigration.
Well, illegal immigration is against the law. Okay, so I'm against that, Jim. I believe that people should obey the law. There should be no amnesty. But there should be a way for people to immigrate legally, and it should not be a difficult one. I was speaking with a businessman whom I support. Why? Because he creates jobs for American citizens. But the money that he receives for these enterprises that he's engaged in comes from foreign nationals. And you want to know where most of it comes from? Chinese American, people from China. Why? Because they want to immigrate. There's a government policy where if a foreign national has $500,000, they can get expedited immigration papers. They can become legal American citizens if they've got $500,000. Well, those folk have the money. Let's make it easy for folk to immigrate if they don't have $500,000. That is the answer to the problem. But granting amnesty to those that have broken the law is not the answer. People should get in line, but it should not be a difficult process. We should not be selective. Money should not buy you legal immigration status, not unless you're willing to provide for the least of these. And that's my stand.
Thank you.
Derrick, thank you very much for your time today. Derrick Grayson is running for the U.S. Senate. Saxby Chambliss is vacating the seat from Georgia. And we look forward to hearing more from you, and I'm sure that we will.
Norvett.